At BAR, we're here to help you with your mining project from concept to closure. If you can mine it, smelt it, move it, or store it, we'll be there. If you can design it, build it, power it, or repurpose it, we'll be there. We help with environmental services, mine geology, mineral processing, material handling, facility and site design, plus tailings management. We'll be there for water resources management, field performance monitoring, mine closure, remediation, reclamation, and more. We'll meet you at any step of the way. We're an employee-owned company with world-class expertise and a nimble, flexible approach that puts you first. Our commodities experience extends from nonmetals and industrial minerals such as potash, coal, and sands, to metals such as iron ore and copper, from precious metals such as gold and silver to rare earths. You need consultants you can count on. If you can dig it, process it, or store it, BAR can accomplish it.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Minimizing Delays of Regulatory Approvals for Your Mine Site. I'm Todd Fasking, I'm with BAR, and we'll be hosting today. BAR has assisted national and international mining and minerals processing clients with complex large-scale projects for more than 60 years, and we offer assistance with everything along the mining development life cycle. By integrating engineering and environmental expertise, we can provide a streamlined approach to your project, one that improves efficiency, communication, and understanding of both the small details and the big picture. So before we begin today's webinar presentations, here are some logistics. First, if you're having trouble with Teams, please send an email directly to Lisa Unger. Her email is up on the screen, who's our administrative support for today. Second, the chat function in Teams is disabled. So instead, there's a link to a form to submit technical questions or discussion topics on the fly. I'd encourage all of you to submit questions during my colleagues' presentations, and we'll accumulate these and address them in the final 15 minutes of today's presentation during the Q&A. You should already be viewing the presentation slides, which will be sent out at the end of the presentation, along with a recording of the webinar. Finally, our contact information will be posted on the last slide today, so please feel free to reach out directly to any one of us with any questions you might have. That being said, I will get into introducing the speakers and the topics, but first, let's do a safety share. One of the biggest things that we run into in our day-to-day activities is lifting, and very important relative to the ergonomics to do it safely. Back injuries account for 1 in 5 workplace injuries and over 2 million injuries across the country, half of them being at the workplace. So let's not be one of those statistics. What can we do to avoid that? Having talked to many folks, know that we're limited with staff and help, and we're super busy, and we're rushing, and that can lead to safety problems and cutting corners. So it's important to revisit the little things and get back to the basics. And proper lifting and back care is covered by that as well. So just a quick refresh: never attempt to lift a load by yourself, especially a heavy load. If you've got some help, go ahead and use that help. Make sure you stand close. As you can see in the graphic, the further out it gets, the more stress and the more risk you have. Make sure that you use your legs and your core. Part of that is the proper lifting, so make sure you squat. And to help keep you aligned and everything from getting too far out of place and putting too much stress, keep your head straight up. And that will help you keep that alignment and minimize the risk. So let's just remember those as we go through the rest of the year and try and avoid being one of those statistics. Nobody wants to be impacted by a back injury. So on to the more interesting stuff. Tina will be talking, for starters, about setting yourself up for a successful project. Tina's in our Minneapolis office, and she has over 20 years of experience as an expert in leading multidisciplinary permitting and environmental review teams. Next, Shanna will talk about setting your project up for successful agency review. She's also in our Minneapolis office and has 18 years of environmental consulting experience with a specific focus on environmental review requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and state equivalent processes. Third, Bernardo will talk about regulatory updates and emerging issues, and he'll draw upon his 30 years of experience in environmental regulatory compliance, primarily in NEPA and also the Endangered Species Act. Last, I will host the Q&A. I've been with BAR since '93, and I primarily practice in multimedia permitting across North America. In this final segment that I'm hosting, I will return to moderate the responses by the presenters to the questions and comments that you share through the chat function throughout the webinar. So next, I will turn things over to Tina.
Thanks, Todd. Permitting new mines or mine expansions in North America is really more critical than ever to ensure that a secure and stable supply of the essential minerals we need for a variety of different industries, including technology, defense, and renewable energy. But getting a mining project through the environmental review process is not always easy, and it certainly isn't always quick. If we look at the plot on the left there that's showing completion times it's taken mining projects to get through the federal NEPA process from notice of intent to record of decision, we can see a lot of variability in the duration it takes projects to get through, right? From super fast on the 1 to 2 to 3 year time period to way too long in the 9 to 10 to 10 plus time frame. Certainly, the complexity of the project matters. The jurisdiction it's in matters. But so do a lot of other factors that are solely within the project proponent's control. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, focusing first on what some of the challenges are for why mining companies struggle to hold their own schedules. My colleague Shanna will then provide some strategies for mitigating some of the more crucial obstacles that companies face. And then finally, Bernardo will wrap up the discussion, providing an update on what you need to know about the changing regulatory landscape, because obviously we know that this has a huge effect on schedule as well. We were batting around the idea for this webinar, and we started brainstorming, the typical advice we give our clients for what they can do to minimize the time it takes to navigate the environmental review and permitting processes. We all had, 15 to 25 years of experience with environmental review and with mining. We've learned some things, right? We've seen what has gone well, right? What strategies have been successful. But we've also been part of projects where there have been delays, and the delays have been caused by the missteps of the project proponents. So I was feeling really good about the list we had generated. And I thought, well, let's see what ChatGPT has to say about this. 17 seconds later, ChatGPT had articulated 7 strategies that project proponents can employ to help reduce the time required to navigate regulatory processes. So I looked at this list and was like, yes, this was almost exactly with what we had come up with. But then I had a moment of panic, because why would anyone spend an hour listening to us when you can get all of this really good advice in 17 seconds? So before I answer that question about why you should keep listening, let's first see what ChatGPT actually had to say. And here it is, right? These are the 7 strategies, according to ChatGPT, for how to reduce time navigating environmental review processes. So while many of you might be jotting these down, these suggestions, because they are good suggestions, I suspect that many of you are looking at this list and saying, well, yeah, this is all pretty obvious stuff. And it is. But I can give you examples where companies have gotten tripped up when trying to do these exact same things. So what isn't ChatGPT telling you? Or maybe put another way, why should you keep listening to us? And that's because in the real world, it's really hard to do these things or even to know what they really mean. So let's dig into this a little bit. One of the things that makes it really hard is that there are competing demands and processes that are not designed to sync up very well. And I've grouped those into 3 different buckets. The first being project design and engineering, the second being stakeholder engagement, and then finally financial disclosures and funding type considerations. So first, let's think about project design and engineering. A company has options for how far they advance the design of a project before starting the environmental review or permitting processes. You also get to make decisions about how sophisticated you get in considering project alternatives. Likewise, how far you advance the assessment of impacts on the project you're proposing. Shanna's going to talk about these later 2 bullets in a little bit, so I don't want to go into too much more detail on those. But I do want to spend just a little bit more time talking about that first consideration, right? The level of design of the project. I've worked with companies that have successfully navigated environmental review and permitting when starting at the PFS level. Likewise, I've worked with companies that have been successful, waiting until they have FS level of design to start the process. There really is no right answer on when to start the process in terms of how far you've advanced engineering. But it is important to recognize that there are risks associated with both options, and that you really need to think through those risks and then manage them. It's just a simple example, right? The more advanced the engineering is, the higher the likelihood that you have, or the more comfort you can have that project that is going to be financially viable, right? That is the reason you go from PFS to FS. But on the flip side, there is the risk that the design is going to have to be redone, right? Part of the permitting process is intended to look at alternatives and whether there are changes that should be made to the project to result in better environmental performance. So the further you advance the design of the project, there is that risk that that's going to be somewhat wasted energy or effort if you have to go back and do some project changes. So thinking about stakeholder engagement, right? We all know that it is desirable and quite frankly expected to have early stakeholder engagement. Heck, even AI told you that. But what you communicate with whom and when needs to be thought through in the context of project design. Right? Certainly, I've worked with companies that don't want to start engaging stakeholders until they have a really fully designed and thought out project. Right? There's a fear of prematurely setting expectations that could change as engineering advances. However, it is important to recognize that one of the objectives of stakeholder engagement is actually listen to the stakeholders, understand the concerns, and then adjust the project in order to address those concerns. The more advanced the design is when you begin stakeholder engagement, the more of a challenge it is to make these types of changes. And it can feel disingenuous to those across the table from you if you're coming in with a fully cooked, PFS or FS level design before you start listening to them. And then finally, financial considerations. These always come into play on projects. And this is where I've seen a lot of companies really struggle. How are you going to manage your permitting schedule when you discover a new ore zone after you've already started the environmental review process, and maybe an ore zone that you want to modify your mine plan in order to capture? Or, what's going to happen when you release a new 43-101 document that has a slightly different or maybe a totally different project than what's currently going through environmental review, right? We've all seen the projects or heard about the projects where the opposition groups have latched onto this and made claims of sham permitting, right? Because the project going through environmental review or permitting is different than what was in financial disclosures. You can't always avoid this, but what I'm encouraging you to do is to really think through how these schedules are going to line up, and then start to develop strategies early for how you're going to minimize the risks associated with that. There are no right or wrong answers for how you're going to navigate these various processes. What I hope you take away from this is, first and foremost, to just recognize that there is this tension between the processes, and that this tension can make it difficult to maintain permitting schedules. The second takeaway I hope you get from this is that you have choices in the decisions you make. So be thoughtful in developing your approach, right? Think through what are the risks associated with the various decisions, and then proactively develop a strategy to manage those risks. So I recognize this was at a pretty high level. I'm going to turn it over to Shanna, who's going to dig into some of these topics a little bit deeper and really has some good advice on specific things you can do to reduce schedule risks.
Thanks, Tina. So Tina set the framework for gearing up for a successful project. You're going to hear me use the term stable project. What is a stable project? It's a project description that you can present to regulators at the point that you're ready to engage with them formally or officially. So you can talk with them about the project informally. So now this is what we're going to be submitting to them when we're ready to talk about it formally. It's a description that's been vetted for feasibility to the point where there are no substantive changes or modifications expected. So your access road may shift, 20 feet to the west. What you're not doing is moving your access road 15 miles to the south at this point. We're going to touch more on what developing a stable project means, but in our experience, completing an early critical issues analysis can be really important in stable project development. A critical issues analysis is a high-level assessment of potential project concerns or even red flags that need to be accounted for in further planning and project development. It's important to do this for each alternative that you're considering to help you weigh your options both from a business standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint. A critical issues analysis can help you determine early on if there are any showstoppers. For example, if you're planning to place a project feature on top of a highly protected resource like a fen, or if you have any landowners that are just simply a hard no. This analysis is helpful to inform where potential impacts differ between project alternatives. For example, alternative X crosses this much sage-grouse core habitat and alternative Y crosses that much, and what the potential mitigation implications could be. Sometimes the cost of mitigation efforts can help inform your decisions. This type of analysis can also help you determine if there are scheduling factors you should be aware of, like seasonal timing constraints for surveys or even for construction, and allows a space for upfront conversations on overall schedule and implications of slips. If annual reporting or financial disclosures are needed, the critical issues analysis can identify where these fit into your environmental review process. This analysis can look different based on the needs of a project and a project's unique concerns. We typically coordinate with a client upfront to determine what issues will be included in the analysis. Some clients like seeing this deliverable memorialized as a memo. Other folks like it as a table. We've even sometimes used, stoplight color coding, the red, green, yellow, to serve as a quick visual for when you're comparing alternatives. Now that we have a common understanding of what a critical issues analysis is and how it can be used, we want to touch a little bit more on what a stable project is and how to get there. So again, a stable project is that solid project description that gets used when you're ready to begin formal discussions of your project with stakeholders. It essentially serves as that bridge between a concept and a tangible concrete project. Project changes along the way. How many times have you worked on a large project and it ends up being exactly 100% what you thought it would be? Doesn't usually work that way, right? Documenting design decisions and assumption provides a change record and serves as a resource to help the team remember why something needed to change. It's also a helpful tool for a long-term project, especially if you need to work through managing staff changes, either within your organization or amongst your design and permitting teams. Having a sound data collection and management plan contributes to developing a stable project because it provides actual data to inform project development. In some cases, multiple years of data collection might be needed to inform project design and then to assess impacts. Sometimes these studies collect huge volumes of data, like a groundwater monitoring program. And it's good to have a plan for how the data will be reviewed, organized, and ultimately used. Within considering plans for data collection, don't ignore the cost of time. If your data collection plan's a little light, can you afford potential delays associated with an agency requiring additional data collection? Lastly, it's important to make sure that the project you're developing is one that can actually be permitted. A critical issues analysis can also vet for permittability. Stable projects don't tend to undergo redesign or need to add significant engineering controls once you enter a formal environmental review or permitting process, because these items have already been integrated with permitting as part of project development. That integrated coordination to develop a stable project can also allow a project to plan for impact minimization during its development. Your regulators are going to be looking for this, and you can improve permitting efficiency by showing how you have already taken efforts to minimize impacts by the time you bring your formal project description to the agencies. Not having a plan for change management, because change is inevitably going to happen, can be disruptive to stable project development. Furthermore, it can lead to delays if change management processes need to be created on the fly as issues come up. Along with a change management plan comes a process for documenting those changes. Lastly, and this might seem simple, but projects can come to a standstill when there is confusion over who the final decision maker surrounding a change is. Identifying that decision maker for the overall project, or at least by discipline, early on can keep the wheels turning when a decision on change needs to be made. When managing change, it's important to come back to 3 key factors: cost, schedule, and risk assessment. What's the cost of a change? What schedule implications does the change pose? And what are the risks of making or not making the change? So you just heard the word schedule. Schedule is a really important part for maintaining a stable project. Part of a stable project is that it imparts credibility, and maintaining schedule commitments help with building that credibility, especially once the project becomes externally visible to agencies and the public. There are both internal and external factors that can influence your schedule. The internal factors are those things that you can control and plan for. For example, how long does the technical team need to review a certain project feature? Do certain deliverables need management or even board approval prior to submittal? But there are external factors that you cannot control, such as how much time an agency needs to review a document and provide comments on it, whether or not they need to elevate it to a district or state office level review, or even if it needs to go to somebody in Washington, D.C. to review. These are important to understand in schedule control and important for managing schedule expectations. In internal schedule management, it's important to not set up a false schedule. It becomes really hard for your team to understand what their actual deadlines are and to prioritize accordingly. It's also important to consider what the repercussions are of not meeting your schedule internally. Are you working with agencies who only publish notices monthly, and it means a delay of a couple days now results in a month-long formal delay? Does it mean that a competitor's project gets in the queue before yours? Does it does not meeting your schedule pose cost or risk concerns? The last tip I'll offer for schedule consideration in helping a project progress effectively is to account for reporting in your project schedule. This isn't just the time it'll take to write a report, but it's also the time needed for technical review, QA/QC, formatting, management, and running it through the layers of review that may be required in order to allow for a document that your company has approved and authorized for submittal. We've talked about some of the elements that come together to develop a stable project and are now moving on to how you can best move that stable project through coordination with your regulators. This is where developing a stakeholder management plan at the beginning of a project can be helpful. In this plan, you break down your list of agency and other stakeholders and develop an action plan for how you'll deal with each. For regulators, it's important to acknowledge where the differences are in your point of contact and any known preferences that that person might have. It's important to account for differences between agencies, across geographies, between different district or regional offices within the same agency, and also between those different points of contact. Understanding the agency's structure and how your point of contact fits into that structure can let you tailor your engagement approach to not only best meet their preferences, but also to best meet any limitations that that person might have within their position. Along with this tailored message, it's important to understand that engagement requires a targeted plan. We cannot assume that what worked well for the Forest Service in Michigan will plug and play and work for the Forest Service in Montana. A lot of this groundwork can be laid at the beginning by coordinating with regulators informally in advance of submitting that formal information that they need to respond to. So in essence, you're getting to know your regulators before you start asking them for things. Oftentimes, it makes sense to carry your stakeholder management plan beyond what is just required to coordinate with regulators and to also plan for interactions with special interest groups. These groups are becoming more savvy, their ability to influence is increasing, and it's important to take a proactive approach so that you can better drive the messaging that you want to put forward. Within this, though, it's important to remember a few things. Certain engagement is required by regulatory processes. You can begin informal engagement before that formal process, though. And as the applicant, you actually have more control over that informal engagement than once things become formalized through application submittal. Once that formal regulatory process begins, the agency becomes the lead and you have a less prominent role over communicating the message. Additional stakeholder engagement that goes beyond regulatory requirements is voluntary, but it might bring a high level of value to your project. It goes back to considering that cost, schedule, and risk circle. How can you put in a little extra here in order to mitigate costs, schedule, or risk speed bumps that might rise in the future? In developing a stakeholder management plan, you can be planful about who your stakeholders are, but don't dismiss parties just because you would prefer not to engage with them. They're not going to go away, and this can lead to unnecessary challenges later. And lastly, be ready to pivot when something needs to change. So this is where it would be a good practice to include a basic plan for stakeholder engagement in your change management plan. That way you have some framework on, kind of how to navigate any potential changes needed in your stakeholder engagement. I'd like to leave you with some key takeaways for setting your project up for a successful agency review. The first one is to remember the importance of developing project-specific targeted plans for both stakeholder engagement and change management. The second tip is to remember your schedule. And in remembering your schedule, have a plan for how you can control internal drivers because you have more influence over those, and a plan for how you can manage external drivers. How are you going to adapt to schedule drivers that are being controlled by others? And lastly, presenting a stable project at the initiation of formal coordination with agencies and the public is really important in minimizing confusion and delays. I'm going to turn it over next to my colleague Bernardo. He's going to give some updates that are changing the regulatory climate, including some updates that might influence some of your considerations noted on this slide, especially related to stakeholder engagement.
Thank you, Shanna, and hello, everyone. My name is Bernardo Garza, and in this last portion of today's webinar, I will be addressing important updates made to environmental regulations, as well as emerging issues with direct implications to ongoing and future mining projects in the U.S. More importantly, I'll propose some ideas and recommendations to help position your company and projects in ways that may lessen the impacts from some of these regulatory changes and emerging issues, so your projects may move forward with less delays and challenges. Specifically, today, I will be touching on updates to the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, opportunities from a recent decision by the Supreme Court on the Clean Water Act, and possible implications of an ongoing proposal by the Bureau of Land Management seeking profound changes to the land protection policies on BLM administered resources. We'll begin with NEPA. As we know, the Council on Environmental Quality is charged by the Executive Office with issuing NEPA implementing regulations which are in turn used by federal agencies to craft or update their own NEPA guidelines. Through this mechanism, administrations tend to impart a certain tone, so to speak, to NEPA regulations based on the issues that administration want to emphasize because of their impacts to the human and natural environments. Since NEPA's inception, administrations have sought to revise NEPA regulations. This has been especially prominent in the last 3 years. Revisions and updates often reverse or clarify previous ones, sometimes becoming a source of controversy and confusion for agencies, companies, non-governmental organizations, and individuals. Thus, it is crucial for your company and for the regulatory agencies involved in your projects to have a clear and common understanding of settled NEPA nomenclature and regulations in order to avoid unnecessary delays and confusion and be able to move projects forward in a timely and efficient way. The following list of recent NEPA updates is based on recent executive orders, administration proposals, and bipartisan congressional agreements. Out of many proposed NEPA changes, these are the ones that were ratified via the signing of the Fiscal Responsibility Act in June of this year. I believe that most of these updates are familiar to us. Thus, I would like to spend our valuable time addressing those highlighted here, where diligent efforts on anticipating obstacles may make the difference between a delayed or stalled project and one that may move forward. The one federal lead agency update in this list seeks to clarify the roles and responsibilities of lead agencies and cooperating agencies to promote development of a single environmental document and to set clear definitions for the terms used in NEPA analysis and documents. Some of these seemingly innocuous and obvious steps in any serious planning process are actually very important, and insufficiently addressed may cause endless confusion, extra work and expense, and serious delays in project permitting and execution. We advise you to coordinate diligently with all agencies involved and push for the development of a clearly articulated and defined document, such as a memorandum of understanding among all agencies involved, with defined roles, an agreed upon schedule and milestones, and covering possible efficiencies and delay controls that anticipate possible bottlenecks and stumbling blocks along the way. We recommend that your company, from the outset of conversations with the federal government, remind the lead federal agency about the possibility of a project-sponsored or developed EIS, and bring to the negotiation table a capable consultant with ample experience on development of environmental impact statements to push the federal government for this opportunity. For environmental justice issues, we advise that data gathering, baseline studies, and analysis be started early in the permitting process to cover all bases, and to coordinate with the lead federal agency to make sure that environmental justice is addressed thoroughly and throughout the environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. This is very important, as in previous administrations, environmental justice took a back seat, but not so in the current administration. For this administration's recent push to have a stronger and clearer consultation with tribes and coordination with states, this has become a crucial component of project permitting and execution. We find it crucial to be cognizant of the tribes that need to be involved, of the treaties that those tribes entered with the federal government, of the concept of tribal sovereignty, which is being revamped nowadays, and as well as their culture and history. We recommend that tribal outreach begin no later than during the conceptual plan, and that tribal coordination take place often and throughout the project life. We further recommend beginning the outreach informally and prior to federal involvement, considering that the federal government doesn't always have a good track record on tribal outreach, engagement, and consultation. For public outreach, we recommend that public outreach engagement be versatile in its approach, schedule, location, and means of communication, anticipating all possible needs from different publics, not contenting ourselves with the traditional ways in which we used to do or carry out this type of outreach in the past. Appropriate and sincere tribal and public outreach have become a litmus test to a complete NEPA analysis and activities for federal governments. Do not disregard or minimize its importance to your project. This could be one of the places where a project may be stalled or moved forward. With regards to greenhouse gases, climate change, and social cost of carbon considerations, we advise that your company engage qualified consultant assistant from the outset to address the new role that greenhouse gases, the analysis on possible climate change issues, as well as a determination of social cost of carbon consideration play in the NEPA analysis and mitigation. It is crucial that data be collected and analysis be carried out early in the NEPA process and addressed in a robust way throughout the EA or EIS development. It's also very important to have ample and constant coordination with the agencies and the solicitors involved, as the issue of climate change has become a cornerstone of new NEPA analysis and documentation. Regarding climate resiliency analysis, an analysis of the environmental climate resiliency was already part of many recent NEPA analysis and documents. Today, an analysis of the impacts of climate change on the project itself is also required by most federal agencies. Make sure you understand what are the expectations from the lead federal agency regarding addressing climate resiliency for your project and for NEPA analysis and documentation, and request from that agency recent examples of what they consider best documents, best analysis that you and your company may follow as you prepare the NEPA documentation for your project. Moving forward, we would like to quickly address recent updates to other environmental regulations. The Fish and Wildlife Service recently made updates to two policies of importance to mining projects. The Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration announced in June of this year that the agents were rescinding a 2020 rule defining habitat during critical habitat designations. The reason that they gave for this rescinding of the document is that the habitat definition rule prevented them from designating areas that did not currently meet species needs, even if the area could be in the future provide the processes or habitat needs for those species. Similarly, Fish and Wildlife Service updated its mitigation policy with the notable change that it no longer contains the 2016 goal of yielding a conservation gain. Instead, the update policy calls for no net loss of affected resources and stresses that the mitigation recommendation and requirements should focus on important, scarce, or sensitive resources and be consistent with applicable statutory authorities and the responsibilities of action proponents. It is important for your company to closely coordinate with the lead federal agency to make sure that that agency addresses Fish and Wildlife Service concerns with regards to these two policies, as well as the well-known Section 7 consultation needs early in the permitting and NEPA processes. Poor timing to address these issues by the lead federal agency would have great repercussions to your project's timeline and costs. The Supreme Court recent decision in the Sackett versus EPA case redefined what waters of the United States mean for purposes of regulatory processes. Therefore, certain areas that in the past may have been classified as waters of the U.S. may today fall outside of this definition. It is important for ongoing projects as well as prospective mining projects to communicate with the lead federal agency involved in your project to find out if this Supreme Court decision has bearing on your project. In the recent land protection proposal, Bureau of Land Management proposed to include conservation as one of the agency's multiple uses. This expansion of the list of multiple uses would have profound consequences for new mining projects throughout BLM-controlled lands and subsurface resources. Similarly, in that proposal, BLM seeks to codify who and how areas of critical environmental concern are designated. Designation of ASECs also has profound influence on whether BLM may consider allowing mining projects in lands under their jurisdiction. It is important to remain alert to see whether BLM implements this new proposal and what it might mean for your project. Finally, we strongly advise you to always consider state and local regulations, laws, and ordinances on lands where your projects occur or are being considered for new or expanding mining activities. Compliance with these laws is as important as compliance with federal laws. I would like to finish this last portion of today's webinar with a summary of key takeaways. We wish that you will consider our recommendations as you move forward with your mining activities or permit-seeking efforts. We want to thank you for being part of this webinar. We will be addressing your questions in this last part. And now I would like to give the control back to Todd for these final words before closing this webinar.
Well, thank you all for paying attention, and thanks to Tina, Shanna, and Bernardo for that really good stuff there. A lot of things to contemplate, and actually it's already generated a number of questions. So let's jump into the Q&A with our remaining time and answer some of those questions. So the first question, can you discuss the role of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder agreements in permitting? When, who, etc.? I think that goes to Shanna. I think she hit upon some of that in her discussion.
Yeah, I can take that, Todd. So, hopefully the presentation gave a little bit of insight on the importance of considering stakeholder engagement in your project planning and then making a plan specifically for that, because that plan can carry you through then to support your permitting efforts too. So, as mentioned, that engagement can happen informally. That's something where, you're in the community, you're talking to people, they're seeing things about your project. Maybe you have a local office, something like that, or it can happen more formally through public input meetings, project scoping, those vehicles that just have a more formal emphasis around them. So you can even take it one more step in the formal direction than that, and enter into specific agreements. I would say, they're in the past, they've been kind of uncommon, but the climate is changing and we are starting to see that in certain pockets. We've seen in the state of Minnesota that some project proponents have entered into formal agreements with either permitting entities or tribal entities. And they're using these physical agreements as a tool to define their working relationship with each other. So how they will communicate, coordinate, collaborate throughout the process, and then what to expect from each other. Through that, they may define, expectations around, this is how long we need to review documents. This is, we would like a meeting 2 weeks before you submit something, things like that. So that really formal agreement is a much different level of effort, and it's something that you should think about in project development. It's something you should plan for as part of your schedule if you decide you need that in developing your stakeholder engagement strategy, because it is starting to gain a little bit of momentum in certain pockets.
Thanks, Shanna. I'll move on to the next question. Does your mine plan, blasting 3 rounds per day versus 6 rounds per day, need to be fully nailed down before bringing regulators into an air permitting discussion and submitting an application? Or can you proceed with conservative values and get a modification later on? I'll take this one. Probably, there's always a little bit of a depends on there. When you're doing your air permitting, you're looking at the amount of pollutants that are released. And so it depends upon, are the 3 charges or the six blasts and the 3 blasts, are they going to be the equivalent size, or are you going to have basically, are the amount of pollutants going to be generated is going to be greater with the 6? And then that's probably a good thing, because then you can use that as a limit that you won't exceed. So if you're actually less than that, you may not need a modification. Just don't exceed those initial design parameters. Kind of one caveat to that. So you're talking about the air permit. If there's more frequent blasting, there might be something to think about relative to some noise issues and other related components when you're doing your baseline evaluation. But really the key consideration there is, well, what are you going to generate and how will that translate into a limit that you can live with? Next, I believe, is in the opinion of the panel, what is the #1 mistake that mines are making with regard to permitting future projects? How about Tina take that one?
Good question. #1 mistake. I would probably say it's not thinking about the permittability of the project early enough in the engineering phase. So as the project is being designed, it's really failing to think about both the what are the impacts likely to be from that project, and are those types of impacts going to be acceptable? But then also thinking through, regulatorily, are there decisions you can make about how you design your project that affect the types of permits you need? Or put maybe another way, thinking through, can you get out of permitting requirements or engaging with certain agencies or needing a certain type of permit by making project design? So, I guess that'd be the #1 mistake I see, is that folks aren't really thinking through the permittability of their project early enough in the engineering design process.
Thank you, Tina. The next question, please discuss the revisions to NEPA that CEQ issued on 7/31/2023 and how it may impact the permitting process. That seems like that should go to Bernardo.
Absolutely. Yes, we can categorize the proposals by the Council of Environmental Quality into 5 overarching themes. CEQ seeks to first of all provide more efficiency and flexibility to NEPA compliance. They also seek to promote better environmental outcomes with this proposal. Third, I would say, is that they are making sure that public engagement is prioritized. 4, it will be updating a structure and consistency in NEPA documentation. And their last goal in this proposal, or phase 2, is to enhance clarity of the documentation and the analysis. How it may affect ongoing or new projects. First of all, of concern is that the proposed rule seems to undermine the Fiscal Responsibility Act page requirements for environmental analysis by eliminating the requirement that agencies use specific administrative procedures to approve environmental documents that exceed page limits under the guise of improving agency flexibility. So the whole issue of how large of a document the agency or the project proponent needs to prepare needs to be clarified early on in the project, or we could run into delays. Another issue that is of somewhat of concern is that various members of Congress that were involved precisely in the debt ceiling negotiations have already made statements that they plan to oppose provisions that seek better environmental outcomes when it comes to defining the role of environmental justice, the environmental preferred alternative, and also extraordinary circumstances. So I think we need to be cognizant that this may not be totally settled, especially in light of what congressmen are saying. CEQ also is proposing language that will clarify that each agency should consider reasonable foreseeable future climate conditions on affected areas, rather than merely describing general climate change trends at the global or national level. So just simply putting together an analysis of possible implications, possible climatic changes to an area is not something that is quite certain yet. There is no settled science on this, and we need to be cognizant that this could also be a complication. I feel that certain provisions are unfairly targeting mining projects with lengthier permitting times, while other types of projects, for example, renewable energy projects, could end up evading environmental review. So CEQ is basically stating that the short-term impacts of renewable energy projects will have no long-term impacts or implications to climate change, whereas mining projects of other kinds could have climatic impacts. So this is of concern for mining projects, and I think that this is not totally settled, and I think this could be challenged in court and rather successfully. The rule proposes to remove the comment exhaustion process that was added in the 2020 regulations. CEQ contends that it is more appropriate for a court to determine whether a plaintiff may bring claims where another party raised an issue in comments, or where the agency should have identified an issue on its own. So this issue could also be delaying implementation of a project if it's if the plaintiff brings to court and challenges an agency's decision to to deal with whether the timing given for public comment was appropriate. But probably the most significant or concerning issue is CEQ's idea that NEPA should no longer be a simply procedural statute. So this is probably the most concerning part of the current proposal.
Thank you, Bernardo. On to our next question. It's a two-parter, so break it into first part. Largely geotechnical in nature, tailings dam safety is a growing international concern. Have you observed additional layers of environmental type questions arising from regulators regarding tailings dam expansions? I'll send that Tina's way.
Yeah, good question. I would say at this point, I think there's been a lot of chatter about it and a lot of kind of talk about the global industry standard on tailings management, for those of you that are familiar with that. But I've not seen a lot of regulatory changes coming out of that yet. Maybe the one exception is that in some jurisdictions, we are seeing agencies trending towards requiring higher slope stability factors or factors of safety when they're looking at liquefaction and tailings. So that's maybe the one place where we've seen kind of a regulatory response to some of the concern around dam safety and tailings basins. What I will say, though, is we have seen a trend of companies taking it upon themselves really to act on and to track their compliance with the GISTM. So not really regulatorily driven yet, but mostly companies taking it upon themselves to change some of their behaviors or designs around tailings.
Thanks, Tina. Second part of the question, for environmental aspects of expansion permit applications, what have you observed regarding cumulative effects defense requirements with regulatory bodies? Send that Shanna's way.
Yeah, so when we think of cumulative effects, it's important to consider them on a resource by resource basis. There's not necessarily one consistent standard that can be applied across all facets of a project. So, you know, cumulative effects to, let's say, something like a timber stand. A timber stand from a vegetation management standpoint, the cumulative effects associated with removing that might look really different than if that timber stand is considered from the perspective of it being a traditional indigenous gathering source of hunting and gathering type of resource. It's the same stand of trees, but two different uses, two different potential for cumulative effects. And so in that lens for cumulative effects, it's important to get concurrence early on from your regulators and from your tribal partners, you know, depending on the level of involvement with your project, as well as input from non-regulatory standards or non-regulatory stakeholders. So you want your concurrence from the regulators and your tribal or indigenous entities. You want input or information, you know, from your special interest groups, things like that, to help you determine what the appropriate spatial and temporal extents are in evaluating cumulative effects with your projects. The expectations around parties being engaged and providing input into things like cumulative effects, it's evolving. And so that's where that early outreach and planned, you know, really purposeful stakeholder engagement can be to a project's benefit, you know, from everything from, you know, kind of just general coordination to cumulative effects to permitting. That thread you'll see carried through most commonly can help build success.
Thank you, Shanna. I think we have time for one last question. So what are some of the key differences that you have seen in obtaining permits in different states? I think that one goes back to Shanna.
All right. Yeah, there are definitely differences when you think about permitting similar projects in different states. And I think stepping through those differences specifically could probably be its own day-long training. I think the biggest space where we see differences, if I were to kind of roll that up and generalize it a little bit more, is how active the state is in environmental review and permitting compared to if that state's deferential to a federal process. So, for example, in Minnesota, mining projects are subject to state level environmental review process. And then they may also be subject to federal level environmental review if they're on federal lands. But, then there are projects in other states like Utah or Nevada where, there's not the state equivalent environmental review process, and it gets rolled and is led by the federal units of government. So, that's kind of one procedural difference that we see pretty commonly across states, especially where mining happens. There are also technical issues that can look really different depending on where you're at geographically in North America. So likewise, in addition to the technical issues, there are the number of active tribes and the level of engagement that those groups expect can vary quite differently, between Canada, the Intermountain West in the US, the Midwest in the US. We're seeing different landscapes emerge there. So, this is where that critical issues analysis that we talked about and having a good thought out stakeholder engagement plan can be really important in identifying and understanding those differences if you're working across states or if you're working on a project in a new state.
Thank you, Shanna. Appreciate that. We're running up on time, so I think I'm going to close here. If you have any other questions, or if we didn't get to your question, we'll get back to you. If you have a question, go ahead and post it in the chat using the form. But thank you all for joining us and participating in the Q&A and listening to the presentation. And obviously, thanks to the presenters for putting the time and effort in to do that. If you do have a question that didn't get answered or comes to you later or would like to follow up on something, please reach out to one of us directly as well. And as a reminder, the recording will be emailed and shared with all registrants. So thanks again and have a safe and productive Tuesday.